Back in 2015, China unveiled a plan so big, so ambitious, that it would eventually spark a trade war and completely redraw the map of the global economy. It was called Made in China 2025. Now here we are, nearly a decade down the line, and it's time to ask, what happened? Did this grand strategy work? Did it create a new tech superpower? Or did it crumble under all that international pressure? Let's really break it down. But to get it to really understand the shockwaves this thing sent out, we have to go back in time. Think about the world in 2015. It was, in a lot of ways, the peak of a certain kind of globalization. The conventional wisdom, especially in the West, was that if you just let the markets do their thing, everything would be fine. Supply chains would be efficient, countries would specialize in what they do best, and everyone would benefit. Into that world, China dropped a plan that was the exact opposite of that idea. It was a loud and clear statement that the government was going to step in, pick winners and losers, and that national goals were way more important than market logic. It was a declaration that the future of technology wasn't something you just participated in, it was a prize to be won. So you see, this document wasn't just some dry economic policy. No, it was a geopolitical earthquake disguised as an industrial blueprint. And the aftershocks from that quake? We're still feeling them today, in everything from the technology in your pocket to the global competition between nations.
This right here, this one question, it's the absolute heart of the matter. For decades, the world had a pretty clear idea of China's role. It was the world's factory. You design it somewhere else, say California, and China builds it efficiently and at a massive scale. Made in China 2025 was basically a declaration that this arrangement was over. China didn't just want to build the world's stuff anymore, it wanted to invent it. This pivot, this ambition to go from being the assembler to the innovator, that is the key to understanding all the drama that followed. Let's really dig into that idea because it's crucial. Think of it like the difference between an amazing line cook and a world-famous head chef. The line cook is incredibly skilled, fast, and essential. They can take a recipe and execute it perfectly, 1,000 times a night. That was China's role in the global economy for 30 years. The indispensable line cook assembling our phones, our computers, our toys with unmatched efficiency. But the head chef, well, the head chef creates the recipe. The head chef invents the menu, sources the special ingredients, and most importantly, owns the intellectual property, the value, the brand, the magic of the final dish. All the big profits, the prestige, the power, it all flows to the chef. Made in China 2025 was China's official application to become the head chef of the 21st century economy. It was a plan to move away from the low-profit, labor-heavy work of putting things together and into the high-profit, knowledge-heavy work of design, branding, and innovation. And a shift like that, well, it changes everything. It changes who gets rich, who controls the most important technologies, and ultimately, who gets to set the rules for everyone else.
Okay, so to really get the plan, let's dive into the mindset of 2015. What problem was China actually trying to solve here? You know, every big, bold national strategy starts with a deep-seated anxiety, right? A feeling of vulnerability that leaders believe they have to fix. For Beijing at the time, the worry wasn't a lack of growth. I mean, the country had seen decades of absolutely explosive economic expansion. No, the fear was about the kind of growth they had and whether it could last. They could see a future on the horizon where wages were rising, making that old world's factory model too expensive. And they could see a future where their dependence on foreign technology could be used against them, like a weapon. They were looking for a way to get off that treadmill before it was too late. That phrase right there on the screen, big but not strong, it's the perfect summary of that core anxiety in Beijing. On the surface, China was a giant. It was making more stuff than anyone else on the planet. But underneath, it was stuck. It was at the bottom of the global value chain. Just think about it. The cars driving on the streets of Shanghai, mostly designed by European and Japanese companies. The airplanes flying across the country, they were almost all from Boeing, an American company, or Airbus, a European one. And the most critical part of any modern device, the semiconductor chips inside their phones, designed in America or the UK, built with Dutch machines and fabricated in Taiwan. China's role was often just the final, least profitable step of putting it all together. Let's really think about that auto industry example. For years, big names like Volkswagen or General Motors operated in China through these joint ventures. It looked like a partnership, sure, but in reality, the foreign company held all the cards. They had the engine tech, the platform design, the brand that people wanted to buy. The Chinese partner, they provided the factory and the labor.
They did the heavy lifting, but a huge slice of the profit and all of the core intellectual property went straight back to Germany or Detroit. The same story was true for aviation. Being able to build a big passenger jet is a huge status symbol for an advanced country. In 2015, that exclusive club really only had 2 members, Boeing and Airbus. For China, with its enormous and growing travel market, having to buy all its planes from foreign suppliers was both a massive drain on its economy and a strategic headache. But the most sensitive spot, the most acute vulnerability, was in semiconductors, those tiny little silicon brains that power our entire world. China might have been assembling the world's electronics, but it was designing almost none of the advanced chips that made them work. This wasn't just about economics. This was a massive national security issue. It meant that at any moment, a foreign government could theoretically just turn off the tap and cut off the supply of the most critical component in the modern world. That's a vulnerability no rising power wants to live with.
And so this was the proposed solution, Made in China 2025. And let's be clear, this was not some vague aspirational goal. It was a highly detailed, state-driven strategy to upgrade the country's entire industrial base from the ground up. The sheer scale of the ambition was just breathtaking. The plan was to leap from making things like t-shirts and toys to making things like high-tech robots and advanced medical devices. To go from just assembling iPhones to actually designing the very chips that power them. Now that phrase high value added is really important here. What does that actually mean? Well, think about your smartphone. The raw materials inside it, they might be worth a few bucks. The process of assembling it in a factory, that adds maybe a few dollars of value. But the powerful little chip inside, the famous branding on the back, the sophisticated operating system it runs, that is where hundreds and hundreds of dollars of value are created. And that is a value that China wanted to start capturing for itself. This was also about avoiding a classic problem that economists call the middle income trap. This is what happens when a country grows really fast using cheap labor and exports, and it reaches a certain level of income, but then it gets stuck. It's not the cheapest place to make things anymore, so it loses business to poorer countries. But it also doesn't have the innovation to compete with the most advanced economies. It's trapped in the middle. To escape that trap, you have to transition to an economy that's driven by innovation. Made in China 2025 was, at its core, China's detailed, heavily funded roadmap for making that great escape.
And this plan wasn't just thinking about the next 10 years. It laid out a much, much longer vision. As you can see on the screen, 2025 was really just step 1. The ultimate goal way out in 2049 was to put China at the very top of the global manufacturing pyramid. To get there, the plan was very specific about where to focus the nation's energy and money. And those dates, they weren't picked at random. They are deeply symbolic. 2025 was the immediate 10-year goal. 2035 is the next big milestone. But 2049? Well, that year will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. By tying the plan's ultimate goal to that hugely important date, it was elevated from just being an economic policy into a core part of the country's entire national identity. It frames technological leadership not just as a way to get rich, but as a kind of patriotic destiny. The wording of the steps is also really deliberate. Step 1, join the ranks, suggests getting to a place of parity, of being in the same league. Step 2, reach the mid-level, implies getting even better in expanding those capabilities. And step 3, become one of the world's leading manufacturing powers, is about as clear as it gets. That's an unambiguous statement of intent to be at the very top, to be the one setting the standards and leading global innovation. It's a patient, step-by-step, and incredibly bold strategy.
To achieve this, the plan didn't just talk in generalities. It identified these 10 critical sectors for a massive state-funded push. You can look at this list as a roadmap to where Beijing believed the future of the global economy was heading. It wasn't just a random collection of industries. It was a carefully chosen portfolio targeting everything from electric cars and airplanes to robotics and biomedicine. And it was this explicit targeting of the industries of the future that really set off alarm bells in capitals like Washington and Brussels. Let's just look at a few of them to understand the thinking. New generation information technology is right at the top, and for good reason. This covers everything: 5G, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and of course, semiconductors. This is basically the digital nervous system of any modern economy. If you can lead here, you have a massive advantage in almost every other field. Then you've got new energy vehicles or NEVs. This was a really clever strategic move. Instead of trying to play catch-up and beat the West in the 100-year-old game of gasoline engines, China decided to try and leapfrog everyone, straight to the next generation of electric cars. It was a field where no one had a huge, insurmountable lead yet. This was a bet on dominating a huge future market and on achieving greater energy security. And then there's aerospace equipment. As we talked about, this is about national pride, but it's also about breaking that hugely profitable Boeing-Airbus duopoly. Every single sector on this list was chosen because it was seen as absolutely critical for future economic growth, national security, or both.
And yes, those alarm bells in the West, they started ringing very, very loudly. What China described as a plan for domestic industrial upgrading, the West increasingly saw as something very different, an economic declaration of war. The problem wasn't just the ambition. Lots of countries have industrial policies. The real flashpoint was the methods the plan seemed to encourage. From the Western point of view, this didn't look like a fair race to innovate. It looked like a state-sponsored playbook that involved pouring massive subsidies into Chinese companies so they could undercut foreign competitors, putting pressure on foreign companies to hand over the technology just to get access to the Chinese market, and protecting their own national champions from any real competition. It was seen as a direct challenge to the entire system of global trade, an attempt to rewrite the rules for China's benefit.
This quote from the U.S. Commerce Secretary at the time just perfectly sums up the American reaction. In Washington, this wasn't seen as a plan for healthy competition. It was seen as a state-funded blueprint designed to dominate the most important industries of the future, and that was seen as a direct challenge to America's own technological leadership and its economic security. Let's really chew on that phrase for a second. A direct threat. That's incredibly strong language. This wasn't framed as just an economic challenge or a competitor. It was seen as something strategic, something existential that threatened the very foundation of American economic power. For decades, the U.S. had been the world leader in the highest value industries. Think aerospace, software, semiconductors, biotech. That leadership created millions of high-paying jobs, it fueled innovation, and it was a cornerstone of American influence around the world. Now, here was a public document from a rival power, basically listing those exact same industries and saying, we're going to dominate those now. From the American perspective, if a heavily subsidized Chinese company managed to put a company like Boeing or Qualcomm out of business, it wasn't just a corporate loss. It was a national security loss.
And pretty soon, those feelings turned into action. In the spring of 2018, the whole thing just exploded. The U.S. slammed tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods, and the U.S. trade representative was very clear. They were specifically designed to hit the sectors that were prioritized in the Made in China 2025 plan. Beijing, of course, hit back immediately, and just like that, the trade war was on. This timeline shows you just how fast it all escalated, a real tit for tat. But it's important to understand the official reason the U.S. used. The legal basis was something called a Section 301 investigation. This is a tool in U.S. trade law that lets the president take action if a foreign country is found to be using unfair trade practices. The investigation took months and concluded that China's practices around technology transfer and intellectual property were hurting U.S. businesses. This report was the legal ammunition. It allowed the U.S. to argue that this wasn't just random protectionism, but a targeted response to documented behavior. So when that list of $50 billion in goods came out, it wasn't just random products. It was packed with things from those 10 key sectors: robotics, aerospace parts, advanced machinery. It was a direct economic missile aimed right at the heart of the plan.
Now, to understand why the West was so alarmed, you have to see it in this context. The fear didn't just appear out of thin air. Look at this chart. China's share of global manufacturing had already gone through the roof, from less than 10% back in 2000 to almost a third of the entire world's total by 2016. Made in China 2025 wasn't just some plan on paper, it was a strategy to pour rocket fuel on a fire that was already burning incredibly hot. Let's just take a moment and really look at what this chart is showing us. Manufacturing value added is a super important metric. It's not just the total price of the goods being sold, it's the net wealth that is actually created during the manufacturing process. For one single country to go from under 10% to over 30% of the world's total in just 16 years, that is an economic transformation on a scale and at a speed that is basically unprecedented in modern history. It's the biggest shift in global industrial power in a century. So you can imagine when leaders in the West saw this trend line, and then they read a detailed plan that said, we're going to accelerate this and take over all the most valuable parts too. They didn't see a developing country just trying to catch up. They saw the world's #1 manufacturing power laying out a plan to use the full force of the state to dominate all the important industries of the future. The plan seemed to confirm their worst fear.
So, we've had a decade of ambition, a decade of trade wars, of global upheaval, of massive investment. What actually happened? Let's move past the headlines, past the fears and the rhetoric, and actually dig into the data. It's time to pull out the scorecard. The plan had very specific goals for 2025, and now that we're basically here, we can measure the results. Did the plan work? Did the American trade war manage to stop it? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, isn't a simple yes or a simple no. It's complicated.
You may have seen this number floating around in news reports. One major analysis, which went through and tracked hundreds of very specific, very granular technical goals laid out in the plan's own roadmaps, came to a stunning conclusion. A staggering 86% of them were achieved. So that's it then, right? Case closed. An A+ grade. A massive success. Well, not so fast. A big headline number like 86% can be both really impressive and, at the same time, pretty misleading. Why? Because think about it. Not all goals are created equal. Imagine your to-do list for building a brand new car from scratch is just 2 items long. Number 1, design a revolutionary new engine. Number 2, install the windshield wipers. You can check off install the windshield wipers pretty easily. But is that really the same kind of achievement as designing the engine? Of course not. That 86% number includes a lot of smaller incremental wins. It doesn't tell us how important the other 14% were, the goals that were missed. And as we're about to find out, that missing 14%, well, it contains some of the most critical, most foundational technologies that the entire plan was supposed to master.
When we look at the plan's own official, top-level targets, we start to see a much more nuanced picture. Let's walk through this report card. First up, R&D spending. The goal was to have companies spend 1.68% of their revenue on research and development. They actually hit 1.71%, so that's a clear win. Check mark. Next, the Quality Competitiveness Index. The goal was 85.5, and they hit 85.6. Another clear win. They definitely succeeded in improving the overall quality of their manufacturing. But then, look at the other rows. Digital tool adoption. This is about building smart factories, using automation, Industry 4.0 stuff. The goal was 84%. They're at about 80%. So they're close, but not quite there yet. And then you have the biggest miss, the industrial waste recycling rate. The goal was 79%. They're way down around 60%. That is a big shortfall. So the verdict here is pretty obvious. It's a very, very mixed bag. It shows they were great at meeting input goals, like spending money on R&D, but they struggled more with complex implementation goals, like digital transformation, and especially with green goals, highlighting that classic tension between growing fast and growing clean.
Okay, so let's move beyond the abstract numbers and get into the real world. An economy isn't just a spreadsheet, right? It's made of real companies making real products with real capabilities. Where did this massive plan actually succeed in creating genuine world-beating champions? And on the flip side, where are the critical weaknesses, the choke points that still remain? The true test of a plan like this is whether it created industries that can actually win on the global stage on their own. And some of the results, well, they're impossible to ignore. You can see them on the roads, and you can see them in the skies.
Yeah, the successes are highly visible. Take a look at the auto industry. Just a few years ago, the electric vehicle market was all about Tesla. Now, a Chinese domestic brand, BYD, has blown past it to become the world's #1 seller of EVs. That's a huge win. And then you look up in the sky, and you'll see the C919, China's first large passenger jet. It's now flying regular commercial routes, directly challenging that old Boeing Airbus duopoly. These are tangible, massive, real-world achievements. Let's just take a second on the BYD story because it's a perfect case study. The government decided NEVs were a strategic priority. They poured in subsidies for both the car makers and the car buyers. This created this huge protected home market where dozens of companies could get started and compete. BYD won that domestic battle, partly because they were one of the few that was vertically integrated. They don't just build the cars, they're also one of the world's biggest battery makers. That gives them a huge advantage in cost and supply. Now, the C919 jet is also a huge symbolic victory. It's a massive point of national pride. But, and this is a really big but, it also tells another story. Because while the plane is assembled in China and a lot of the body is made there, it is still critically dependent on the West for its most important parts. The engines, they're from a joint venture between America's GE and France's Safran. The avionics, the landing gear, many other key systems, also from Western suppliers. So the C919 is this fascinating paradox. It's a huge triumph of China's industrial power, but it's also a perfect illustration of where its technological weaknesses still lie.
And the list of wins goes on. In high-speed rail, China is not just a leader, it is the undisputed global champion. They have more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. In 5G technology, despite years of intense pressure from the US, a company like Huawei is still a dominant global force. And then there's this statistic, which is just staggering. Chinese shipyards now have over 200 times the production capacity of shipyards in the United States. 200 times. In these sectors, the plan was an undeniable home run. But, and you knew there was a but coming, this is still only half the story. The wins are real, but they don't cover up the weaknesses that remain.
So where did the plan struggle the most? It comes down to what Chinese analysts themselves call the 4 fundamentals. Think of these as the deepest, hardest-to-reach layers of a high-tech economy. It's one thing to assemble a final product, like a jet. It's another thing entirely to master the secret recipe for the super alloys that go inside its engines. And this is where the real challenge, the biggest hurdle, remains. Let's go back to that restaurant analogy. The final dishes coming out of the kitchen, the assembled products like EVs and trains, they're world-class. That's a huge success. But the 4 fundamentals, that's the stuff that happens before the cooking even starts. It's about 1, being able to create your own unique, specialized ingredients that nobody else has. That's core basic components. 2, mastering those deep, difficult techniques like fermentation or complex sauces that take years to perfect. That's advanced basic processes. 3, being able to forge your own unique steel to make your own knives. That's key basic materials. And 4, running the best culinary school in the world to train the next generation of genius chefs. That's the industrial technology base. You see, you can import good knives and good vegetables for a while. But to be a truly self-sufficient, world-leading power, you have to master these fundamentals yourself. And that's the gap that Made in China 2025 has found hardest to close. And that failure to master the fundamentals leads directly to this: critical choke points. These are the specific areas where that lack of deep knowledge really hurts. The most famous one, of course, is in advanced semiconductors. China can design some pretty good chips now, but it still has to rely on foreign technology, specifically advanced lithography machines, to actually manufacture the very best ones. The same is true for the highest-end CNC machine tools, the ultra-precise robots that cut metal. It's true for commercial jet engines, and it's true for a range of other key technologies you see here. In these absolutely critical fields, true self-sufficiency is still a very long way off. These choke points are the direct symptoms of that weakness in the 4 fundamentals. Let's be specific. That advanced lithography for chips, that market is dominated by just one company on Earth, ASML in the Netherlands. Their most advanced machines are maybe the most complex things humanity has ever built, and you cannot make cutting-edge chips without them, and China has been blocked from buying them. Those high-end CNC tools, you're still looking to Germany and Japan for the absolute best, the ones with the highest precision. Those jet engines, that requires a mastery of material science to create alloys that can survive insane temperatures and pressures, a skill perfected over decades by companies like GE and Rolls-Royce. In all of these areas, you can't just solve the problem by throwing money at it. It requires this deep, accumulated knowledge that is incredibly difficult and time-consuming to build from scratch. So, what is the lasting legacy of this whole 10-year saga? It's actually not just about what changed inside China's borders. It's about how this plan fundamentally rewrote the global playbook for everyone. You could argue that the biggest, most lasting impact of Made in China 2025 isn't the electric cars it helped create, but the powerful global reaction it provoked. It forced a conversation that a lot of countries, especially in the West, had been avoiding for a long, long time. A conversation about the role of the government in shaping a nation's economic future in the 21st century. And this is perhaps the greatest irony of the entire story. For decades, leaders in the US and Europe preached the gospel of free markets. They would constantly criticize China's state-led model, wagging their fingers and saying, "That's not how you do it." But the perceived threat from Made in China 2025, combined with its visible successes, forced a complete U-turn. All of a sudden, industrial policy wasn't a dirty word in Washington anymore. It became a strategic necessity. The old Washington consensus, that belief in deregulation and minimal government intervention that had dominated economic thinking for 40 years, was effectively dead. The debate in Western capitals shifted overnight from whether they should have an industrial policy to how to design the best one to compete with China. In a strange twist of fate, China, in its quest to catch up with the West, ended up forcing the West to become a lot more like China. And this slide right here shows you the new reality. This is the new playbook. On one side, you have China's plan, broad, state-led, aiming for dominance across a whole range of sectors. On the other side, you have the West's response, things like the U.S. Chips and Science Act. It's also a state-led plan with massive subsidies, but it's much more targeted, focusing on bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S. The big takeaway is clear. The era of hands-off government is over. We have entered a new age of strategic, state-backed competition between the world's major economic powers. The comparison is really telling. Think of Made in China 2025 as an offensive strategy. It's broad, it's sweeping, and it's trying to conquer a lot of new territory all at once. The U.S. Chips Act, on the other hand, is more of a defensive strategy. It's narrow, it's targeted, and it's focused on protecting one single, absolutely critical fortress, semiconductors, to make sure the country can't be cut off from its supply. This is the world we live in now.
But we have to ask, was it all worth it? As the head of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China points out here, yes, there has been a lot of success, but it didn't come for free. It came at a significant cost. This quote perfectly frames the last piece of our puzzle. We've talked about the wins and the losses, but now we have to look at the side effects, the unintended consequences. Because things like efficiency and waste, they're also a measure of success. And on that front, this story gets a lot more complicated.
So what does that cost look like in the real world? Well, one of the biggest costs has been something called overcapacity. It's an incredible amount of waste. When the government decides that a certain sector is a winner and starts throwing cheap money at it, it creates this crazy gold rush mentality. The electric car industry is the absolute perfect example. The government put up a giant neon sign that basically said, "Free money for EVs." And what happened? More than 100 different companies jumped into the business. The result? A total bloodbath. Vicious price wars, companies going bankrupt left and right, and billions upon billions of dollars in wasted investment. And today, out of all those hundreds of companies that jumped in, guess how many are actually making a profit? Only about 3. 3 out of more than 100. This is a classic downside of top-down industrial planning. It leads to this malinvestment where money just flows to anyone who can get in on the government-backed boom, not necessarily the best companies. And while all that chaos did eventually produce a couple of global champions like BYD, it came at the cost of immense waste. And it's created a new problem of that excess capacity now flooding into global markets.
So, what's the final verdict? After 10 years, Made in China 2025 was, without a doubt, a success. But it was a partial success, it was a very costly success, and it was a genuinely transformative success. It did create global champions in some key areas, but it failed to conquer those critical choke point technologies. And maybe its biggest legacy of all is that it dragged the entire world into a brand new era of head-to-head industrial competition. The old simple rules of globalization are gone, and so the question that we're left with is the one you see on your screen. In this new game, with its new rules and a world of competing national plans, who will build the future?